Okay, let's see what you have to say. Morals and markets. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. I'm
Yeah.
doing good.
I was convinced that God exists because of the philosophical arguments for it. Primarily the uh, the argument from contingency, as well as the argument from change. Those are two really strong arguments. I've also been exploring the transcendental argument for God.
Hmm.
But contingency is the one I'm more familiar with, the one that I discuss mostly with others.
Yeah.
Um, I find that to be very, very strong.
What's the what do you find to be strong about it?
I think that it's great because it appeals to things, to metaphysical realities that are readily apparent to us. For example, that some things are contingent. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, because I always like to say coffee because coffee's always in front of me. The coffee, for example, just doesn't it hasn't always existed. There was a point in time which it came to exist, and even when it does exist, it changes. Changes temperature, for example.
Hmm.
So, that's one thing where it's like, okay, well, at least coffee is contingent by definition of what contingent is.
Hmm.
Um, and I just really like how it's not also, it doesn't really get wrapped up in the argument as to whether or not the universe is infinite or not, because it just isn't concerned with that. Aquinas, who was the most famous user of this argument, he said that he just wasn't really concerned with that. That was what the other philosophers were doing at the time, the
Yeah.
Islamic philosophers and all of that. And he was just like, it doesn't really interest me. This argument works either way because he's only concerned with current causation.
Hmm. Current
I found
causation.
yeah, and it's also very interesting because a lot of it disproves the God created the universe and then hands off opinion, because if that were the case, then things couldn't exist right now. So it's
Hmm.
basically like, because things currently exist, there's a list of current causes, and because that current cause list must terminate in something necessary that isn't contingent, then yeah, everything that
Hmm.
exists right here and now is actively being held into existence, which is really cool. Um,
Everything is held into existence. Okay. So
everything that's contingent.
now I see that I can understand the contingency argument because everything that we observe appears to be have a cause
Yeah.
and so appears to be contingent. But does that necessarily mean everything is contingent, or that yeah, doesn't necessarily mean that there is one thing that is necessary?
Um, yeah, so that's actually why the phrase over time, or the first premise over time, has been modified
Mm-hmm.
um, to get to the true meaning of what Aquinas meant. So by the time
Right.
Aquinas got a hold of it, he started with the first premise saying that some things are contingent.
Okay.
So because we can at least think of the coffee, for example, as contingent by nature of it coming into and out of existence, transforming and changing. Um, that's all you really need to do so far just to prove the bare bones qualities of God. And so that's what's so interesting about it to me. So it's also been historically very important for anyone who defends this argument not to start with everything is contingent, um, because, or that everything that exists is contingent, because then of course is contingent, because then of course you'd run the risk of making an argument that is special pleading for God. Um,
How do we differentiate between what's necessary and what's contingent? Because if you're saying some things are contingent, how do we tell the difference?
yeah. So we have to discuss the nature of contingent things and the nature of necessary things. And a
Mm-hmm.
necessary thing as well, it's important to differentiate between a necessary thing and a brute fact. A brute fact is, in traditional philosophy, is something that has no explanation. It's metaphysical rock bottom. That's
Mm-hmm.
a phrase used by Graham Oppy, who I respect. Um, But a necessary thing is something that has to exist, doesn't change, or excuse me, we'll even take out has to exist. We'll say a necessary thing is something that just is not contingent, doesn't change, doesn't come into and out of existence. We know that that thing has to exist by virtue of knowing that contingent things can't ultimately explain other contingent things. Um, because traditionally in philosophy, if your argument runs the risk of an infinite regress, that's considered a bad argument. And so
Hmm.
that's why the
How
contingency argument
so?
is,
How is it bad? How's infinite regress a bad argument?
yeah. So the famous example that a lot of people use is if you can consider. Sorry, there's an ambulance going by.
No,
Okay,
it's
yeah.
okay. You can barely hear it, so
Okay,
I
good,
can hear you better than I can hear that. So it's
good.
okay.
All
Go ahead
right.
and keep talking. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
okay.
So you say that you come upon a chain that's suspended in the air, and you want to
Hmm.
look at the bottommost link and say, okay, why is this link suspended in the air? And then
Hmm.
you keep, someone says, well, the other link above it is suspending it. Well, that's true, and that is somewhat of an explanation. It's not what we would call an ultimate explanation. And so there's
Hmm.
still, metaphysically speaking, is no reason for that one link at the bottom to be suspended in the air. And so another person can come along and say, well, what about the link above that one? And again, that's just another contingent thing. And because of the nature of contingent things, it itself doesn't either currently exist by its own power, nor does it currently suspend something by its own power.
Hmm.
It borrows that power from another thing. And so
Okay.
you can see how even if I propose an infinite number of links in that chain, unless there's something that grounds the suspension of that chain altogether, there is no ultimate explanation. Now, why is this important? Okay, well, because you might say, well, why do we need an explanation? Well, this ties into the principle of sufficient reason. Um, People who deny that there needs to be a reason or some sort of ultimate explanation for contingent things, not only is that often countered by the argument from absurdity that or ad absurdum that leads to
Hmm.
absurd consequences such as well, if we can't ground anything in that, then there really isn't any reason for anything to exist at all, and you might be fine with that, but that also means that you can't really interpret reality. um, that seems to
Okay.
be one of those, um, because ultimately nothing really means anything or is explained by anything. Things happen
Hmm.
often without reason at the metaphysical
Okay.
bottom of things.
Now
Okay,
let me
go ahead.
ask you this: is because I can see the instance like a chain hanging from the sky, for example,
Yeah.
and you wonder how's it hanging from the sky. Now, is that to say then that infinity is impossible?
Actually, that's another interesting subsect. That is sort of, it's not saying that infinity is impossible. It's saying that an infinite regress of current causes
Hmm.
for a contingent thing is impossible, or at the very least, metaphysically
Right.
absurd. And so that's why Aquinas, for example, is not scared of the proposition that perhaps the universe is infinite, because this argument only applies to time zero, like the current present moment. What are the current causes currently acting on a contingent thing as it
Hmm.
exists here now? Um, and
And so,
so
are you saying then that it's impossible to have an infinite number of causes in the past?
Uh, not, not really. I don't think that he is. I'd have to go back and reference what his
Okay,
specific
because
argument is.
if it's a not really, then that would mean that infinite regress is impossible. Or I'm sorry, not impossible. Infinite regress is possible.
It would be, yeah, what you would be referring to would be an infinite regress of causes at different times. This is just proposing that there can't be an infinite regress of current causes. So, like a
Of
specific
current
type of,
causes.
yeah, of specific type of
Okay,
causes.
right. A specific type of cause. However, if we're talking about an infinite regress of causes, can't there be an infinitesimal change of causes going back into the past, which would therefore be an infinite regress?
Actually, you know what? Now that you say that, I want to say that that would also be considered impossible.
How
Uh,
so?
because it would run into the same. And again, I'm not super familiar on what Aquinas has to say on that, but
Mm.
again, I'd have to go into. It's definitely interesting. But if I had to guess, it's going to run into the same problem as the infinite regress of current
Mm.
causes, as it can't really
Okay.
ground. It can't really ground an explanation for anything in reality, both here and now in the case of infinite current causes and in the case of infinite past causes.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. So that's interesting. Definitely something to think about. That one right there.
Well,
I
okay.
gotta
Well,
see
let
what
me
the
ask you this
response
then.
is.
Is there, okay, so we can take this on a smaller scale. Is are there is there such thing as 1 second into the future?
Oh, okay. The time theory. That's something I'm not really really
Well,
strong
I'll
in.
okay. Well, it's
Because you
but
can
I
be a
can.
presentist, and
Mm-hmm.
not
You could
and
be.
think that yeah that the past and the future don't really exist.
Well,
I guess.
I'm not getting into it that way. I'm just asking. 1 second into the future exists, correct?
Uh,
Like
I
one
don't.
second from now.
I want to say. I don't want to say no. I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't. I want to say no, but as I answer
You
that, it
want to.
becomes real.
Right. As you answer, it becomes real. So then that means there's also 1 second into the past. That exists as well.
Uh,
Yeah.
I
Because
lean towards
we can think of
presentism.
1 second ago. Like we can say, hey, what happened 1 second ago? And we can articulate that, right?
Yeah, but it's no longer in reality right
It's not
now.
in
So it
reality,
was. It,
but it's not it's not in reality. However, it is a thing. It is something. Well, I mean, at least on a metaphysical metaphysically, 1 second ago existed or exists, right? We know what it is. So because you
yeah.
would never say, because then that would mean that you could never tell anybody that you had lunch last week, right? You could never tell anybody that you talked to your parents yesterday or something like that. Like
Okay, I think
because
it's I think the language is tripping me up because I would
yeah,
say
it's
yeah,
I mean, but
it's
it
tricky to
does
try to use language
yeah.
to describe it. This is where the but yeah, I would say
Mm-hmm.
because I would say it no longer exists.
It no
But
longer
through
exists.
through shared experience, which of course this
Okay.
gets into transcendental categories, but through shared
Right.
experience, that's the only way you can know that
Okay.
history happened.
Okay. So then that being the case, so then we can just look at the future for us, the 1 second into the future for a moment here.
Yeah.
How are there now, is it true that there are an infinite number of like milliseconds, microseconds between 0 and 1 second?
I think that there's I think maybe if we're speaking about potentiality, perhaps as far as in reality, I would hesitate to say I would say maybe no. For the sake of argument, I'll declare that there isn't. See, this is where it gets tricky. I'm not super. I am kind of a philosophy nerd, but I have not yet
Mm-hmm.
gotten to the time theories, the theories of time,
Okay.
because this is going to involve that. So I
Okay.
have to say
Well,
I'll leave it on
mathematically
this one.
speaking, yeah, because I mean, mathematically speaking, just in simple math, there are an infinite number of numbers between 0 and 1, right? And which also means that there are an infinite number of numbers from 0 to infinity. And then mathematically speaking, there are an infinite number of numbers between 0 and -infinity.
Hmm.
And the time scale very, very closely resembles the number scale. So although time is something that we have a construct of, we use time to, tell us when to go to work, when to go to sleep, all that stuff, when to eat, all that. I mean, that's what we use time for. Um, so if we can conceive of going back into the if we can conceive of going back into the past, even say for 2 seconds, that would mean that between now and 2 seconds ago, there are an infinite number of numbers between 0 and -2. So in that sense, it isn't impossible that if you kind of stretch that to infinite regress, because this is kind of what we're talking, infinite regress of causes, it's not impossible that there could be an infinite number of causes or infinite regress of causes going back. It's not impossible. I'm not a big fan of infinite regress either. Yeah, trust me, I'm not a big fan. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I'm just saying, I'm just looking at possibilities though.
Yeah, here's what I would say to that, with my limited philosophical knowledge of time theory. But I would say that, again, I will retreat into the fact that this is only concerned with current causes. And so
you're saying only current causes.
Yeah, so long as we are explaining why a thing currently is, the number of of seconds or numbers in elapsed time that occurred in the past or in the future is irrelevant to the scope of the or to the purview of this argument. And secondly, I would say that numbers are understood as transcendentals, that they don't really have a causal effect, and so you can't describe the fact that
it's more quantity.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. It doesn't, like, the number 7 can't cause anything. It's just more of like a qualitative sort of descriptor.
It's a quantitative. Yeah, it's a quantitative container, basically.
Yeah. And so because of that, I would say that those aren't causes. And so like elapsed time, we can quantify that, and we can say that there's an infinite amount of divisions. But because those are not causes, then the premise still holds that there can't be an infinite regress of causes.
Okay. All right. Well, we can, since you said you're not comfortable with this, I mean, I can talk about this more if you want, but you did say you weren't comfortable with it. So if you want, we can shift back to necessary versus contingent, because
let's shift to that.
Okay, it's up to you though.
Definitely need to study the brush up on time and philosophy.
Okay. So with necessary versus contingent, now what are the properties of a necessary being?
The property would be, it would pretty much be the properties of contingency. It would be non-changing, does not come into and out of existence, and so
eternal. Eternal.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, eternal, unchanging.
Internal and unchanging. Okay, and those are the two.
Yeah, we'll say that those are the two. Yeah.
And that's it, right? Okay. So
far, as far as the scope of this argument, so far. We could deduce more from the contingency argument. In fact.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway.
Well then, how then does a necessary being, if they're only non-changing and eternal, how does that manifest into contingent beings or contingent things?
How does a necessary thing produce contingent things?
Or how do contingent things come into existence if the necessary being is only non-changing and eternal?
Only non-changing and eternal. Let me think about that one.
Thank you, Caroline.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay, this is going to play into the fact that a thing can't give what it doesn't have.
Right, because you're saying if a contingent thing can't pop itself into existence, right? Then what pops it into existence, right? So that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I would say that I think the way that it's going to be understood in the context of this argument is that the principle that a thing can't give what it does not have, you have to add on what has been traditionally added on to that it can't give what it doesn't have already in some degree. And so a thing
in some degree.
Exactly. So a thing can give, for example, existence, and the thing that the contingent thing comes from has eternal existence. So it has it actually to an infinitely greater degree. And so that's how it's possible for it to give a degree of something else.
A degree of something else, yes.
Case. Okay.
I think ultimately, though, that a contingent being isn't eternal, right? It's finite.
Yes, because it possesses the ability to exist for
or
in time to a more limited degree than its origin.
or at the very least, it has a beginning, because it's possible that a an immortal being could be contingent, right? Like
Immortal
you,
being could be contingent. Yeah, if it
mhm,
changes. Yeah, if
if
it
it
changes.
changes, or if it has a beginning. So that's the thing with a necessary being. Has no beginning, has no end. It's eternal in that sense. But you could be, so we have to qualify that. So eternal, no beginning, no end. Okay. So I gotta write that down, because that's important. Because you
Yeah,
could be a contingent being and have a beginning and then be immortal and
yeah,
never, right? Never have an end. Okay.
yeah. So
But you
long
could
as
still
nothing
be
acts on you. Yeah, for
right,
sure.
right. As long as nothing takes you out, right? But
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
the thing. Okay. So that being the case, it's non-change. A necessary being is non-changing, eternal in the sense of no beginning, no end. So then the question is, how did the first contingent being come into existence?
Uh, okay, hold on. Let me think. Let me scratch about that. How did the first thing come into existence?
First contingent
Uh,
thing, yeah.
first
And we'll
contingent
just
thing.
say thing. It could be a being, it could be a rock, it could be a planet or whatever. Just the first
Yeah,
contingent
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
I would say that it was given existence, which the necessary thing has to an
Okay.
infinite degree.
Okay. So the necessary being brought the first contingent thing into existence. And what property did that necessary being use to do that? What property
Uh,
or attribute, skill, whatever you want to call it? Like, how did it do it?
it's described as will, but again, this is where words are not really going to adequately. They're going to be more
Mm-hmm.
personifications
Mm-hmm.
for, as a way to describe a mysterious concept. So,
Right.
admittedly, as
Right.
far as the mechanics of how it did it, so long as I believe Aquinas would still be happy, so long as the fact that this thing is still, it still seems to be uh, not contradicting the idea that a thing can't give what it doesn't have. Um, a beginning is something that refers to existence in time, which is, see, this is tricky, but I really do enjoy thinking about it. Let me back up. I'm going too far.
No, it's
Um,
okay.
you were saying, can you repeat what you were just saying?
What properties did the necessary being use? What property or properties did the necessary being use to bring a contingent thing into existence? So far you have will, and I don't know if you're like dead set on will. I think you're kind of fleshing that out, but so far that's what I have. Will it will the
Okay.
contingent thing into existence?
Yeah, I would
And
say, yeah,
yeah,
sure.
and we're not really clear on the how. Like, and I'm not so interested in the steps. I'm more interested in the, like, if you were a carpenter and I asked, what tools did you use to build this house? So I'm not interested in the steps you took. I'm interested in the tools you used, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
so I guess that's a better way of putting it. Like, what tools did the necessary being use to bring the first contingent thing into existence? So far, we have will. And I'm not talking about hammer and nails. I'm talking about like will, magic, reason, logic, something like that.
Well,
That's what I'm driving at.
when we're, I don't, we would say that the contingency argument tends to call the necessary thing pure act, or actus purus, to use the Latin
Pure
of Thomas
act.
Aquinas.
It's a
Yeah,
pure
and
act.
so, yeah, so pure act. It's weird to say about to talk about pure act as like what is the tool to bring the first contingent thing into existence,
Mm-hmm.
because bringing something into existence, and this is why I'm actually partial to the infinite past of the universe, but bringing something into existence is seems to be implying or presupposing
Well, I
that
mean, don't you have
that
to do something to bring something into existence? Like, how could you bring something into
yeah,
existence and not do anything?
yeah, so like
Like, it's an act, right? It's an action.
yeah, yeah, act itself. So like I would say that
Right.
was there even a beginning? I'm not so sure. But I maybe would say that I think we're assuming this thing has always acted because it is pure act. And so
Okay.
there is no like there is bringing into existence. This is where language is going to be so limiting in how we're going to be trying to convey these ideas. But
Okay. Well,
there
yeah,
is
in a way it
bringing
is. Go ahead, finish.
yeah, there is bringing into existence, but we say that loosely because we don't really have a better way to describe how uh, how the act has acted, if that
Right.
makes sense. We're using time
Yeah,
limited
I see what
language.
you're yeah, I see
Yeah.
what you're saying. I think that the thing though is that I'm thinking of it in a sense of the first contingent thing wasn't is not. I mean, it could have had it had to have a beginning, right? So then that means, like logically, that means that there was a period of time when the necessary being did not have anything contingent. There, even if it's infinitesimal amount of time, even if it's, just a fraction of a millisecond, a millionth of a millisecond, a billionth of a millisecond. There is a moment that if this necessary being is eternal and non-changing, that there is a gap of time between this eternal necessary being with no beginning and no end, and the first contingent thing. Am I
Oh,
making
okay.
sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So
There's a gap of
common,
time. There has to
yeah.
be.
So
Yeah. There's no
commonly
way the two could
speaking,
exist at the same time. Like it in the at the exact same like there's an overlap of the necessary being and the contingent being. Necessary being is eternity coming along, and then boom, contingent being comes into play, right? So they weren't doing this, right? So there there is a there is a gap between the necessary being's eternity
yeah,
and the contingent being coming into existence.
yeah.
So
Phoenix Parker in the comments has kind of stole what I was going to get at. So I've actually heard this now that you put it that way. Time
mhm.
is a measurement of change, so it is calling into question this time, saying there was a time when. We're necessarily when we talk about time, we're talking about the measurement of contingent things changing. But
Right.
when we're talking about this necessary thing, we're talking about pure act that, for lack of better term,
Sure.
has acted, is acting, and will act.
Okay.
Um, so we're
And
trying. I don't know. As contingent things ourselves, by the way, mind you, we are struggling to understand
well,
the
yeah, but
mechanics of.
I don't want to kind of delve into like into saying, hey, we're just not smart enough to figure this out, right? I don't want to
Yeah,
kind of dive into that. Um, so I'd like to just try to find the words if we can, because
yeah, absolutely.
okay.
Yeah,
So in that sense, then, and so the reason I'm kind of trying to nail down the properties of this necessary being, because so far we have three: non-changing, eternal, and then will, and then they used this necessary being has will, right? And in that sense, does it necessarily now can someone or a being have will but no agency? Is it possible to have will without agency?
if we're describing this thing as will itself, I mean, it's often said that God really isn't kind of like an agent in the sense that we commonly refer to agents, like he's not a moral agent. But
Yeah. Well,
I also,
I'm talking about in terms of just this contingent thing that was first
yeah,
came into existence. And I'm still kind of focused on like how that came into existence. I know we're kind
yeah,
of saying, oh, we can't really say, but in this sense, I mean, I think we can say like on a metaphysical level at least, right? Like we can say, well, you know, um, because I know that you're saying, hey, our words are limited, and we're going to try and apply, physical properties to an eternal being. On the other hand, I think we can at least I mean, because we kind of did that anyway, because we're saying, well, he's necessary, so he's, this God is necessary, and it's beyond our, it's beyond our reach. So we're using our abilities as a basis of comparison, saying,
Yeah.
so in terms of non, because isn't it possible then you could be non-changing and eternal, but just do absolutely nothing? You just sit there and have nothing else,
Uh,
right? So,
yeah, it could be, but I do have to run to a haircut. But Phoenix
oh,
Parker seems to be doing a good pickup of where I was at, so that would be nice if he joined to
okay,
replace me. But I
okay.
really enjoyed
Well,
it. I
yeah,
followed you. I hope I'll come back when I get
well,
done
yeah.
here.
Come on back. I wrote some of this stuff down, so I'll just say yeah, because I'd like to pick up the necessary contingency
Yeah,
argument from
yeah,
there. But okay, well,
yeah. But have a
okay. We'll
nice
talk
day.
to you soon. Yeah, have a
Yeah,
good one. Good
see
talk.
you.